Okay, I want to just take a few minutes to look at the Ten Commandments with you before we dismiss this morning. And then I want to do one other thing that kind of the Lord's convicted my heart about today. So we're in Exodus chapter 20, and I had them printed out. Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments are in the first 17 verses. This is the first time that Moses received the Ten Commandments. You're probably familiar enough with the story that he was up on the mountain. He received the Ten Commandments, and that gets all the attention of what God was doing with Moses on Mount Sinai. But he was up there a long period of time and received a lot of instruction. And he was up there so long that the people, the children of God, those people became so impatient that they decided they were going to build something else to worship. That Moses was never coming back. So they built this calf. They began worshiping this calf. Moses is coming down, sees it, becomes infuriated. He throws the two tablets, and they burst into as many pieces as you can imagine. So that he had to then again, several chapters later in the 30s somewhere, he has to go back and God inscribes the tablets to them again. And so it's 17 verses long. I didn't want to read them, but I put them up. I gave them to our folks so you can see them, so that they're more like we would memorize the Ten Commandments, more like you might know them. And so verse 1 says, "And the Lord spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God." That's how he began the Ten Commandments. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." And then he gave us these commandments. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself any idol of any form. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not covet." Now, most of us memorize those at some point in our life. We've probably forgotten them. If I called any of you up right now, you might know them. You might raise your hand and say, "I've got them," and you may or may not have them. And that's just the way we do. They become so familiar to us that they almost become insignificant. The familiarity of them kind of pushes them off to the insignificant. Several years ago, Lori and I had the privilege to go together to England to do a Wesley tour study, a study of Wesley, John Wesley, and what all he did in England. But we did get to do a few touristy kind of things. And so we went to the Tower of London, which houses the crown jewels of England. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but the royal family of England has jewels in the form of crowns and rings and staffs and robes and all kinds of things that they wear during special ceremonies in England. And they have them stored so that the tourists can come and see them. Well guarded, believe me. There are almost 24,000 jewels that make up all the pieces of the crown jewels. Estimated value of somewhere near $5 billion. A collection of jewels that you can go to England and see today. It is the crown jewels of England that people go and see. The Ten Commandments to the people of God were the crown jewel of their people. It was the crown jewel of the people of God, such that they put them in where? The Ark of the Covenant. And it became so special. The Ark of the Covenant was then described and how it was to be built and how it was to be handled. And it housed the Ten Commandments, the two tablets. And if it wasn't treated correctly, if every instruction wasn't followed exactly the way it was that God told them to follow it, then there were dire circumstances and consequences that would follow. So what Moses got here was just not a list of the first 10 laws that people learned and the Jewish people learned. It was the crown jewel. There was something significant about it. There was something different about these 10 commandments. And what is different about them is that they force you, if you're going to live in these 10 commandments, and if Moses and his people were going to live in these 10 commandments, it forces us to have a God-centered nature about us. It forces out any self-centeredness that we might have. These 10 commandments in their entirety force us, require us, mandate that we be God-centered in our life. That's why they're so important. It almost mandates that our whole life be centered around our relationship with God. Now you're familiar, and I just call this to your attention, that they're divided up, they're divided out into three sections. The first one's focus on your relationship with God. Then there's the one in there that focuses on your relationship with your family. And then the last one's focus on your relationship with all other people. So you're talking about honor God, no, don't worship any more graven images, and then honor your father and mother, and then all those relational about don't murder, covet, commit adultery, and all those kinds of things. And what we soon discover is that if we're going to keep those in every situation, then it forces us. We quickly see that keeping those 10 commandments, and you might say, well, no, keeping a 10 commandment about not murdering is pretty simple. Because we quickly default that by murder we mean taking someone's physical life. But I've mentioned to you before that there's many ways in which you can commit murder. You can mentally commit murder, and so on and so forth. You can steal other than just taking a physical object. And then some of them are pretty simple. But what we quickly see and what we quickly understand is that these 10 commandments are just not the first 10 laws that are given, is that they keep us in every situation focused on God. And so if you were going to say this morning, okay, I'm going to commit myself to keeping the 10 commandments, you better be careful about what you commit yourself to. Because at the end of the 10 commandments, what we don't read very often, and I want to read it to you this morning, is that it says, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. This is right after he gives the 10 commandments. Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that test you by giving you these commandments, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. That's what the 10 commandments are about. The 10 commandments are about being placed in you so that they become part of your life, so that you are so in tune to the fear of God that you will keep you from sinning. Now that's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big deal. And so, they're just not a list of 10 things that we learn as a kid. They instruct our life. I've entitled the message, A Perfect Philosophy of Life. You want a philosophy of life, you need to go old school, memorize the 10 commandments, and seek in every way to follow them. Not only in the natural, but in the supernatural of God in your life. In the spiritual dimension, in the mental, emotional dimensions of your life. Seek to honor Him in everything. Now here's what is interesting about the Hebrew language here. And the same is true in a lot of ways in the Greek language. These just aren't it for the moment. The Hebrew language instructs it and is written so that they're talking about that these 10 Commandments would have value and meaning from now till eternity. They just keep going. The application just keeps going on and on and on. It's just not for right now. It's to keep him in every situation until eternity. And I just invite you to think about that for a minute. I just invite you to think about keeping the 10 Commandments in every situation of your life from now until eternity. And that's how God gave them to the people. He said, I'm giving these to you so that the fear of God will be planted in you, so that it will keep you from sinning. And and to understand the 10 Commandments, you have to look beyond just the words of the 10 phrases and look at the principle behind every one of them. And I don't have time to go through it today, but if you look at the principle behind every one of them, then you can see where it becomes bigger than 10 laws. It becomes instruction for life. It's bigger than just 10 sentences. It says, don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, don't commit adultery. It's not just a list of don'ts. It's a philosophy of life. It's a nature. It's developing your nature to be within the Spirit and in tune with God, so that you can live according to His will and according to what pleases Him. And what the 10 Commandments do, although we see them as quite negative because they were all the last ones, it's kind of, it illustrates, what have you done for me lately? I mean, you read the first ones, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any graven image. Do not misuse the name of the Lord. Those talk about honoring God. Those talk about lifting up God. Remember the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. But then we get down to these do-nots, and we just think that the 10 Commandments are a bunch of do-nots. But what they really are is they're 10 ways, 10 pieces of living that build up instead of tear down. They build up instead of tear down. And that is quite important in our culture today. And so when life gets askew, and I think I could share a lot of illustrations that I can't share out of pastoral confidentiality, but when people come to me and say, look, my life has just gone amok. My life is off the rails. 9 times out of 10, I could point to a specific one of the 10 Commandments. Kind of an amazing deal. When your life gets off the rails, most often, maybe 9.5 times, 9.9 times out of 10, you could point to one of these 10 Commandments, or maybe more. And so they're important. And and a lot of things get lost when we cross from Malachi to Matthew and we get to the cross of Jesus and His resurrection. Some of the things in the Old Testament get lost, but I'm here this morning to say that this is one of the most significant things about the life of Moses, and it is significant to us today. I mean, and unfortunately, the most publicity the 10 Commandments can get these days is based on Roy Moore and his trying to, put them on the courthouse steps, or the state capitol steps, all that kind of stuff. That's where the 10 Commandments is getting attention. It ought to get attention in our life. It ought to get attention in our life. And they have practical application to how you and I live on a daily basis.